So let me get a few things out of the way. I am a big fan of Christopher Nolan. He has made some of my all-time favorite movies, and I have nothing but respect for his auteur approach to blockbusters and the craftsmanship that goes into them. I am also a big fan of Homer's The Odyssey because Greek mythology is something I grew up with. I love Odysseus as a character, the journey he goes on, and I am fascinated by everything and everyone he encounters along the way. Needless to say, I was so excited to see a film adaptation of one of the classics of Western literature made by one of the best directors working today. And despite some reasonable concerns that a lot of us had after seeing the trailers, mainly how dark and gloomy everything looked, believe me, I went in with an open mind and an open heart. I was ready to be blown away, but I was so disappointed. What I left the theater with were some very conflicting feelings because I did not hate the movie. I don't think it's terrible, but the way it felt hollow to me and in many ways in conflict with the ideas of Homer's epic made me feel robbed of a big screen experience this film could have been. I hoped that the trailers were saving all of the myth and magic for the audiences to experience in theaters, but turns out what we saw is exactly what we got. Now, again, and I'm going to keep repeating this, I don't think The Odyssey is a bad movie, even though I don't think it's a great one either, but I do think it's a bad adaptation. Not because it doesn't follow the story exactly as it is written, this is not coming from some blind loyalty to the book, but because it betrays the characters and the themes at the core of it. No adaptation is 100% accurate, and I don't think it should be, but what makes a good adaptation is staying true to what made the source material what it is to begin with. It's the characters, it's the ideas, it's how we feel about the story and what we learn from it. This is particularly important when it comes to mythology because mythology isn't just fantasy fiction, it's folklore. Greek mythology tells us about the beliefs and values of ancient Greeks, about who they were as people and what their culture and society was like. It's ancient truth told through stories that are deeply tied with religion and customs. It's stories that were shaped by many years of oral tradition until they were eventually written down. What we get from Homer's The Odyssey isn't just one of the oldest examples of the monomyth or the hero's journey, but we get to learn so much about the ancient Greeks and their culture. But do we learn about any of that in Nolan's film? Not particularly. And that's without even mentioning the many anachronisms in this movie. I am looking at you, pants, armor, Viking ships, the list goes on. And while you could say that Nolan is continuing the tradition of retellings by instilling his modern ideas and values into the story, I just don't think The Odyssey was the place to do that because, let's be honest, we're not really seeing anything we haven't seen before. We are not replacing what The Odyssey had to say with something profound that we haven't heard. First of all, the themes Nolan is interested in, like guilt, pride, trauma, fear, understanding consequences of your own actions, would fit better in an expanded version of the Iliad. Despite having plenty of myth and magic in it, it's a war story dealing much closer with pride and fate, violence, and the concept of heroism. That and the fact that Nolan put as much action into his Odyssey as he could. Battles and violence were clearly high on his priority list, though their impact in the film is heavier on the spectacle than on the emotional weight. He does make a point with it eventually, but a lot of it leans into action movie type of violence. Second, and equally important, is that the themes of this movie have been done before and better, not just by other films, but by Nolan's previous films. The two most obvious examples of this are Oppenheimer and the Dark Knight trilogy. Oppenheimer in particular is a film The Odyssey has a surprising amount of thematic crossover with when it comes to hubris and consequences, but Oppenheimer does it a lot better, partly because Oppenheimer is a much better written character. We can also see strong shades of Dunkirk here, as Odysseus' soldiers are lost, exhausted, and longing for home. And let's not forget about, no pun intended, themes of memory and the choice of forgetting that were explored thoroughly in Memento and to an extent in Inception. The more I think about it, the more common ground I find between the Odyssey and Nolan's other movies, and in each case, the other movies did it better. Now, I am not here to deny that this is an epic film. I don't think there was any doubt that Nolan was going to make this into a massive, grand spectacle that should be experienced on the biggest screen possible. Shot entirely on IMAX cameras and with a runtime of almost 3 hours, it still is an epic journey, not only thanks to the power of the source material, but also thanks to the incredible amount of work that was put into this film. A lot has already been said about the use of practical effects and horror elements here, which are very impressive. I'm obviously going to get into spoilers here, so spoilers for this ancient, famous classic and one of the biggest movies of the year. But as a horror fan, of course, I loved the insane transformation scene with Cersei. The way she literally molds these faces is unforgettable, and you can just tell those are somehow practical effects. That or Samantha Morton is actually a witch because she is terrifying here, and I believe it. Easily one of the best performances and one of the best parts of the film, despite this portrayal being very different from the book. When it works, it works. My other favorite section happens in the underworld, which is where Nolan's dark and moody aesthetic fits the best. Hades filled me with genuine dread, and this is exactly what it means to capture what something feels like. I've seen different interpretations of Hades in movies and art, but this one felt bleak and sinister in a very special way. Also, an incredibly haunting performance from Elliot Page here. I do wish we got the scene with Odysseus' mother there. If you know, you know, but it's a very powerful scene, so I was sad it wasn't included, but even as is, Hades is probably my favorite part of the film. I've been saying for a while now that I would love to see Nolan do a horror film, and we got a real taste of that in the Odyssey, so I still do hope he makes a full-on horror movie one day. But since I mentioned a couple of performances that I really enjoyed, let me just say that I think Robert Pattinson had the most fun with his character out of everyone. I love seeing him play villains and morally gray characters. He gets to the bottom of their humanity somehow. The script didn't give anyone much to work with here, but Pattinson somehow finds and tenuous in his line delivery, mannerisms, and body language so perfectly. Another couple of standouts are Himesh Patel and John Leguizamo. Really believed both of their characters as characters. And I would also put Tom Holland up there. I was worried I wouldn't be able to unsee Spider-Man with him, but he actually surprised me. I would have loved to see more Lupita Nyong'o. She is barely in the movie, which is a shame because she is so talented and clearly could have done so much with her 2 roles. I don't understand why you hire somebody as brilliant as Lupita Nyong'o and then give her less than 5 minutes of screen time. Why? This just seems like flex casting to me. Same goes for Zendaya, but she ties into a bigger issue of why are we making an Odyssey movie where Athena feels like an afterthought? I would have loved to see Zendaya as the radiant, wise Athena that I know she could have been, but instead, it feels like Chani from Dune stopped by for a few minutes. And we all know how much I love Dune, so no disrespect to Chani, but Chani has her own movie. Where's Athena? Matt Damon, on the other hand, is just Matt Damon. I didn't see Odysseus. And a lot of this is on the script. Again, all of these actors aren't working with much, but some actors are able to rise above the script and some aren't. I don't think this is a bad performance, and I have nothing against Matt Damon as an actor. He's a likable guy, and I think he could have done an interesting Odysseus had he been working with a better script. But this is not Odysseus. It shocks me how little interest Nolan had in Odysseus as a character and in what makes him so compelling and memorable. This is not supposed to be your traditional hero or your typical arrogant movie leader. This man is supposed to be clever, cunning, witty, outsmarting everyone, and borderline a pathological liar because his mind is his superpower and we love him for it. This also gets him in trouble sometimes, but it is literally what he is known for and how he succeeds. Nolan strips him of those qualities at every turn to the point where Odysseus now comes off as kind of dumb, starting with cutting his famous exchange with the Cyclops. I couldn't care less about his journey because he was just a dude getting home, stripped of character depth and personality. And then, in a plot twist, Nolan wants to imply that actually Odysseus didn't want to go home because home is not what it was when he left. Which is a fine idea for a modern war movie, but a really weird take that smells of subverting expectations for the Odyssey. Homecoming is a huge theme for Homer's Odyssey, and Odysseus is tested again and again until he is allowed to return home. He has multiple lovers and multiple children along the way, but we can't have that with our modern hero. That's not acceptable, so that's not in the movie. But he declines comfort, riches, and literally an offer to marry a princess for a home that's clearly not the wealthiest or the most beautiful place. That's how important home is to him. He's held captive by Calypso, not sitting there in blissful oblivion. This is not the same character. And honestly, some of this goes for Penelope as well. We all know Nolan is not the best at writing women, but here he had an actual interesting character to work with. Why did he make her so flat? And is Athena even real? Gods and their involvement have largely been written out of the story here, but with Athena, the mastermind behind so much of what happens in the book, the movie makes you feel like she might actually just be a visual representation of Odysseus's guilt. These are not small changes. These are things that fundamentally change the story. Back to Odysseus, stripping your lead character of his defining traits while not replacing them with anything equally as compelling just left me feeling detached from one of the classics that has stood the test of centuries. The writing is a major problem here. The characters are flat. The emotional investment is minimal. We're not even going to talk about how emotional these men are in Homer's epic. These guys are weeping on the regular. They are tearing their clothes off in emotional outbursts. They're doing all kinds of things that are nowhere to be seen here. What seems to be happening is that the movie is replacing quality writing and emotional investment with casting. Why write Athena? We'll just cast Zendaya. Why write Calypso? We'll just cast Charlize Theron. Why write Menelaus? We'll just have John Bernthal be himself. Why write an interesting layered Odysseus? Everyone already likes Matt Damon. And I'm sorry, maybe this works for some people who are really invested in certain celebrities, but I came here to see an epic story on screen with great characters, and a cast list of famous people isn't enough to make me care, especially when the dialogue is stiff and clunky across the board. The writing doesn't do the actual storytelling any favors either. Let's be honest, the first act is rough. The exposition is awkward. It does get a little better after that, but the story doesn't really flow. It feels like we're going through a checklist of things that happened rather than telling a story where one thing leads to the next naturally. It's not until Odysseus is back to Ithaca that Nolan finally feels like he's in his element. And that is a long time. It's a 3-hour movie, and I felt every minute of that runtime. Why? Because the movie in all that time gives me very little reason to actually care. I never felt genuinely invested in these characters or their problems. I was more interested in Antinous and his scheming than I was in Odysseus, which is not a good sign. Also, I'm just not a fan of movies that spell out their themes, and this one tells you exactly what the lesson is and why. The themes are in the dialogue. Everything is right there on the surface. Everything is obvious. This is too blatant even for Nolan. Where is nuance? Where is complexity? Where is subtext? Are we just assuming media literacy is dead at this point? And then there are the visuals, which are a special source of pain for me. Now hold on, let me explain. My issues are not with shot composition. I am not here saying that Hoyt van Hoytema was asleep at the job, but this dark and moody look, while it undeniably feels very Nolan, is out of place when it comes to Greek mythology in general and the Odyssey in particular. And I get it. A lot of people enjoyed that look. I love a dark and gloomy look, but personally, I did not enjoy it here because the dark aesthetic and the lack of vibrant colors is the last thing that comes to mind when you read the Odyssey. Although I loved that he actually went for the wine dark sea. I do, as always, appreciate a director with a clear vision and a commitment to it. I also hear those of you who are saying, well, this is a grounded and gritty approach to the story, because yes, it is. And I find that approach not only antithetical to the descriptions in the source material, but also visually boring. Sometimes I wonder if Nolan thinks the film needs to be visually dark and gloomy for the themes to land or to be taken seriously. Like, yes, the visual language is important, but I felt like we were, again, compensating for the flat writing by replacing gravitas with dark colors. To me, this is the equivalent of adapting The Lord of the Rings, but making it really grounded and gritty and serious. Why?
I don't want it.
I am deeply uninterested in a grounded take on the Odyssey, the same way I am deeply uninterested in a grounded take on The Lord of the Rings. Other than the Hades scene, I was never genuinely impressed by these locations. And it's not the location's fault. None of them really stood out to me, which is particularly sad when I remember this was shot entirely on IMAX cameras. Great, but why am I more impressed by that information than by what I was actually seeing on screen? When you read the Odyssey, every setting feels unique and mysterious. Where is any of that here? Where is the myth and magic of it all? It looks like Nolan is barely interested in that major aspect of this story. But here's my question. If you are not very interested in the fantastical elements of mythology or the vibrancy of ancient Greece or their culture and customs, then why are you adapting the Odyssey at all? Because he's Christopher Nolan and that's his vision and he can do whatever the fuck he wants. I get it. But this is not, at the end of the day, a good representation of the Odyssey or ancient Greece or mythology. The set design, the use of locations, the armor, the costumes, it's all just sad and for the most part very bland. We barely see the sirens. Scylla and Charybdis are beyond disappointing. The gods are either missing or look no different from random people. How exciting. There is a distinct visual cohesiveness to this world, yes, but to me, this world did not look interesting or memorable. It's a shadow of what it could have and should have been. Ludwig's score, however, is simply incredible. I know not everybody loved it, and I understand why people say it's more of an ambiance score than a traditional score, but I think it was perfect. His approach to it, the instruments he used, how much heavy lifting it does emotionally throughout the film, easily one of the best things about the film. Ludwig understood the assignment. To wrap all of this up, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is undeniably an epic. It looks and feels like one, but it is a flawed epic. It makes sense as a modern retelling with modern morals and values, and it is interesting to see how Nolan interprets this story, but as an adaptation, it does not capture its mythological source material. Despite the shortcomings of the writing, it still feels epic narratively, although a lot of that credit belongs to Homer, not Nolan. However, the way the movie flattens its characters and strips the story of as much myth and magic as possible is disappointing. Yes, there are some fantastic performances. Yes, the practical effects look amazing. Yes, I loved the horror elements. Yes, there are parts of it that do feel like epic filmmaking, but so much of this feels empty and surprisingly lacking in creativity or a sense of wonder. I don't actually think that Nolan fundamentally misunderstands the source material or anything like that. I just think he's not very interested in the elements that made the Odyssey so legendary or in what makes Odysseus such a fascinating character. What he is interested in is creating his own modern myth based on the Odyssey. It is his vision and his ideas. It's a very Nolan Odyssey. Who would have thought? And I do respect this from an artistic point of view. I love a director with a vision, and it is not a bad film. However, I have very little interest in a dark and brooding version of the Odyssey that prioritizes being grounded and focusing on guilt and trauma and regret. A lot of this is directly antithetical to what Homer wrote. Look, I've seen Oppenheimer and I love that movie, but I came to see the Odyssey, not the themes of Oppenheimer revisited in an ancient Greek setting with a less compelling protagonist. I can't believe I'm saying this, by the way. Never in my life have I found Odysseus to be an uninteresting character. Until now. Does Nolan think his movies need to be dark and serious to make a point? It definitely seems that way, but adapting the Odyssey while being afraid of its fantasy elements or the complexity of its characters is a very odd choice. Those fantastical and religious elements are a major part of Greek mythology. This doesn't stop those ancient texts from being dramatic, impactful, or emotional. You don't need to be afraid of myth and magic to have gravitas, because this interpretation here, it left me feeling detached and unengaged, which shouldn't be the case. I want to care. I want to love this movie because I already love this story and these characters. This isn't a bad film, and there are things to admire here, but was Nolan the right person for this project? No. I don't think so. I don't know when we're going to get a real adaptation of the Odyssey, one that trusts its audience and doesn't spell out its lessons in the dialogue, one that isn't afraid of itself or its characters, one that transports us and stirs our imagination. But I still hope that we will eventually get one.